The first thing he saw was the dust they kicked up, a pale, tired ghost clinging to the road that led to nowhere but his land. It was a thin banner of distress against the blood-orange smear of the setting sun. Elias Thorne watched from the porch of his house, a house that had held its breath for 5 years. He stood with a cup of chicory water cooling in his hand, his knuckles white around the tin. He was a man made of fence wire and silence, weathered into the landscape like the gray, splintered posts that marked his property line. The dust cloud grew, and beneath it, figures resolved themselves from the shimmering heat. Not riders, not a wagon. They were on foot, small shapes moving with a slowness that spoke of an ending. He set the cup down on the rail, the tin making a hollow sound that seemed too loud in the vast, open quiet. There were 10 of them, girls. The oldest looked to be maybe 16, a woman grown by the hard math of this land. The youngest was a bundle she carried on her hip, a tiny, sleeping thing no bigger than a loaf of bread. The others filled the space between, a ragged staircase of age and weariness, their dark hair matted with the grime of the trail, their clothes little more than frayed whispers against their skin. They stopped at the edge of his property, where the wild grass met the memory of a yard. They stood huddled together, a small island of humanity in an ocean of unforgiving dirt. The lead girl, the one who was almost a woman, had eyes that were ancient. They were not pleading. They were not defiant. They were simply empty, as if she had poured out everything she had just to get this far, and now stood hollowed out at his gate. She held the hands of 2 of the smaller ones, her grip a silent promise she probably had no way of keeping. They were Apache, he knew, driven from the foothills by the blue-coated soldiers and the righteous pronouncements of men in far-off cities. They were debris from a broken world, washed up on his shore. He saw the town's judgment on them like a brand. The torn hems of their dresses, the bare, cracked feet, the way they flinched when a horse whinnied from his barn. They had been pushed along, from one unwelcoming shadow to the next, until the only place left to go was his. The place everyone else avoided. The Thorne place, where a ghost and a grieving man kept each other company. For a long time, nothing happened. The sun bled out across the horizon, and the wind began to turn mean, picking up grit and flinging it with a dry hiss. The girls did not move. They just stood there, waiting, for him to yell, to fetch his rifle, to turn them away like all the others had. Elias was not a man given to grand gestures. His heart was a locked room, the key long lost in the earth next to the simple wooden cross that bore his wife's name, Sarah. But he recognized the shape of their silence. It was a cousin to his own. He descended the 3 steps of his porch, the wood groaning under his weight. He did not walk toward them. He walked toward the water pump, its iron handle rusted and cold. He worked the handle, the shriek of metal on metal a protest against the quiet. Water, dark and clean, gushed into the stone basin. He left it running. Then he turned and walked back into his house, leaving the door ajar. It was not an invitation. It was a fact, a statement made without words. Here is water. Here is shelter from the wind. What they did with it was their own affair. He moved to the window, standing back in the shadows of the sparse room. He watched as the lead girl hesitated, her head cocked like a nervous deer. She looked at the darkening sky, then at the small, shivering children around her. He saw the struggle in the set of her shoulders, a weight too heavy for a girl of 16. Finally, she let go of the other children's hands and took a tentative step onto his land. Then another. She led her small, silent flock to the pump. She cupped her hands, drinking first, then patiently gave water to each child, from the oldest down to the smallest, whose face she splashed gently until it woke with a soft cry. When they were done, she looked toward the house, toward the sliver of light from the open door. It was a long moment. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath. Then, slowly, shepherding the others before her, she walked toward the porch. The intervention was not a single act, but a slow, unfolding thing, like a clenched fist uncurling one finger at a time. It began with the quiet declaration he had made in town 2 days prior. He had gone for salt and flour, his visit as brief and silent as always. The girls were there, huddled by the livery. A problem the town marshal, a portly man named Breckenridge with a face like spoiled meat, was trying to solve. He called them vagrants, wards of the territory, a nuisance. He spoke of sending them to the reservation up north, a place everyone knew was a synonym for a slow death. "They're wild," one woman had muttered, pulling her own child close. "Filthy," another had added, her voice sharp with disgust. Elias had just stood there, his bag of flour in his hand, listening. He looked at the lead girl, at the fierce, protective way she positioned herself between the world and the smaller children. He saw not wildness, but the desperate courage of a cornered animal. He saw the ghost of his own Sarah in that stance, a woman who would have faced down a grizzly for what was hers. Breckenridge had been talking of tying them in a wagon and shipping them out like cattle. "For their own good," he'd said, puffing out his chest. Elias had stepped forward then. The crowd quieted. He so rarely spoke that his voice, when it came, sounded like it came from under floorboards, rough and unused. "I'll take them." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. Breckenridge had blinked. "Take them? Thorne, what in God's name for? They're savages." "I have room," Elias had said, his gaze flat and unmoving. "And work. They can earn their keep." It was a lie, and it was the truth. He had more work than one man could handle, but he had managed for 5 years. The truth was in the space between the words, in the hollow echo of his empty house. A few coins had exchanged hands, not as a purchase, but as a filing fee, a piece of paper that transferred the burden from the town to him. It was a release. Breckenridge was glad to be rid of the problem. Elias was simply acting. He felt a pull, a sense of duty he could not name. It was the same duty that made him right a fallen fence post in a storm. It was just something that had to be done. Now, standing in his own shadowed kitchen, he heard the soft, hesitant scuff of bare feet on his porch. He heard the whisper of the lead girl telling the others to be quiet. He did not move. He let them cross the threshold on their own. They stood in a tight cluster just inside the door, blinking in the dim lamplight, looking small and lost against the vastness of the room. The house was one big space downstairs. A kitchen area, a stone fireplace, a table, and 2 chairs. A ladder led to a loft where he slept. Another door, firmly closed, led to the room that had been Sarah's. He did not approach them. He simply pointed toward the bunkhouse, a small, sturdy structure visible through the back window. "There," he said. The single word was all the instruction he gave. Then he turned his back on them, a gesture not of dismissal but of trust. He went to the larder and took out a side of bacon, a sack of potatoes, and a loaf of his own dense, slightly burned bread. He set it all on the table along with a block of lard and a skillet. He did not look at them, but he felt their 10 pairs of eyes on his back, a silent, questioning weight. He took his rifle from its pegs by the door, grabbed a bedroll and walked out, closing the main door behind him. He would sleep in the barn. He didn't lock doors, had never seen the point. A lock only kept out the honest. He was giving them the house, a sanctuary against the night. It was an unspoken contract. You are safe here. The journey to a new life began not with a step, but with a sound. The sound of a broom. The next morning, when Elias came in from the barn, the house was different. The 10 girls were gone, presumably back in the bunkhouse, but they had left a mark. The floor, which had been coated in a fine layer of dust and neglect, was swept clean. The skillet was washed and set by the hearth. The leftover bread was wrapped neatly in a piece of cloth he hadn't seen before. It was a quiet thank you, payment in labor. He accepted it in silence, cutting a few slices from the bacon and frying them for his breakfast. That day, a routine began to form, a silent dance of cohabitation. While he worked the fence line, mending wire broken by winter snows, he would see the girls emerge from the bunkhouse. The lead girl organized them with a quiet efficiency that was mesmerizing to watch. 2 of the older ones were sent to the creek with buckets. Others were tasked with gathering firewood. She herself, with the baby still strapped to her, would pull weeds from the hard-packed earth around the cabin, a futile but determined effort to impose order on the chaos. They never spoke to him. If he approached, they would fall silent and still, watching him with wary eyes. He learned to give them space, to move around them as if they were a natural part of the landscape, like the juniper trees or the granite outcrops. He provided for them. Each morning he left food on the porch, flour, beans, sometimes a rabbit he'd snared. Each evening, the empty containers and a swept porch would be waiting for him. They were stitching their lives together with the raw thread of work, creating a pattern of shared existence without a single word. Small gestures became their language. One cold evening, he noticed the bunkhouse door didn't seal properly, letting a knife edge of wind slice through. The next day, he spent an hour planing the wood and rehanging it. He left a pile of extra firewood by their door, more than they would need for the night. A few days later, he came back from the far pasture, his shoulders aching with a weariness that went bone deep. On the simple wooden cross that marked Sarah's grave, someone had placed a single, stubborn prairie wildflower, its purple head a small, defiant splash of color against the weathered gray wood. He stopped, his hat in his hands. He knew who had done it, the lead girl. He had seen her from a distance, watching him when he went to stand by the grave, as he did every evening. She had seen his ritual of grief, and she had honored it. Something in his chest, a thing he thought had turned to stone years ago, shifted. The thaw continued, slow as a winter creek unfreezing. He began to eat his evening meal at the table inside the house again, instead of on the porch. The first time he did, the girls, who had been cooking over the hearth, retreated to the bunkhouse with their food. The second night, he took out 2 extra plates from the cupboard and set them on the table before he went out for his evening chores. When he returned, the lead girl and the next oldest were sitting at the table, their heads bowed, waiting. The other girls ate on the floor by the fire. It was a step. They ate in complete silence, the only sounds the scrape of forks on plates and the crackle of the fire. But it was a shared silence now, not an empty one. He made bread one day. It was a disaster. A hard, dense brick that could have been used to stone a fence post into the ground. He looked at it, then at the girl who watched him with her unreadable eyes. He grunted. That loaf died in vain. For the first time, the corner of her mouth twitched, a flicker of something that might one day become a smile. The next day, there was a new loaf on the table when he came in. It was perfectly formed, with a golden brown crust. He broke off a piece. It was light, warm, and tasted of the sun. He looked at her. "It's a little dry," he said, his voice a low rumble. She met his gaze, and this time her expression was clear. It was a look of wry challenge. "You did not complain about mine," she said. Her voice was thin, reedy from disuse, her English broken but clear. He was so startled to hear her speak that he almost dropped his piece of bread. He just stared at her. She looked down at her plate, a faint flush rising on her high cheekbones. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer a wall between them, but a space they now shared, a space where a voice had finally been heard. The moment of true vulnerability came on a night when the wind howled like a hungry wolf, rattling the windows and making the whole house moan. He was in the loft, half asleep, when a sound from below cut through the storm. It was a cry, but not a loud one. A choked, terrified whimper, like a caught animal. He swung his legs over the side of the loft and climbed down the ladder. The main room was lit only by the dying embers in the hearth. The little girls were asleep in a pile of blankets near the fire. But the lead girl was sitting bolt upright on her own small pallet, her hands clenched in the thin blanket, her body trembling. He stopped a few feet away, careful not to crowd her. "You hurt?" he asked, his voice low. She shook her head, her gaze fixed on the closed door to Sarah's room. Her eyes were wide with a terror that had nothing to do with the storm outside. "Don't lock me in," she whispered, the words so faint he barely caught them. "Please, not a small room." He understood then. Her past was not just a story of hunger and flight. It was a story of cages, of being trapped. He thought of Breckenridge and the casual way he'd spoken of locking them up. He thought of the soldiers, of what might have happened before they even reached the town. He walked past her, not to the bunkhouse door, but to the door of Sarah's room. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment. Then he turned the key in the lock. The click was loud in the quiet room. He pushed the door open, revealing the simple, dust-sheeted furniture inside. He turned back to her. "I don't lock doors," he said. "Not in this house. Not ever." He left the door to Sarah's room open. It was a violation of his own private grief, an opening of a wound he had kept sealed for 5 years. But her fear was more present, more immediate, than his old sorrow. He went back to the hearth, added a log to the fire, and sat in one of the chairs, his rifle across his lap. He didn't go back to the loft. He just sat there, a silent sentinel, until the first gray light of dawn crept through the windows and he saw that she had finally, exhaustedly, fallen asleep. From that night on, the house was different. It breathed again. Sarah's room was no longer a tomb, but just a room. The girls, seeing the door open, eventually started to drift in, their curiosity overcoming their fear. One of the little ones found a small wooden bird Sarah had carved. She brought it to him, holding it up in her small hand. Elias took it. He ran his thumb over the smooth, worn wood. He remembered the day Sarah had carved it, her laughter filling the small room. He looked at the child, then at the lead girl who watched him from the doorway. He did not smile, not quite, but the hard lines around his eyes softened. He gave the bird back to the child. "Her name was Sarah," he said to all of them. "She would have liked you." The past intruded on a Tuesday. It came in the form of a single rider, a dark shape growing steadily larger on the horizon. Elias saw him from the ridge where he was resetting a stone marker. He knew, with a certainty that settled like a cold rock in his gut, who it was. Breckenridge. He left his tools where they lay and walked back to the cabin, his stride long and purposeful. The lead girl was outside, showing one of the smaller children how to properly gut a fish by the creek. She saw him coming, saw the look on his face, and her hands stilled. She rose, wiping her hands on her dress, her eyes fixed on the approaching rider. The air of peaceful routine shattered like glass. She gathered the other girls with a series of quiet calls and shooed them into the bunkhouse, her movements swift and protective. She did not go with them. She came and stood on the porch of the main house, a few feet from where Elias had stopped. She did not look at him, but he felt her presence beside him, a silent ally. Breckenridge rode into the yard with an air of arrogant authority. His horse a fine, well-fed creature that looked out of place against the rugged backdrop of the ranch. He reined in, looking down at them from his elevated position. "Thorne," he said, his voice slick with false cordiality. "Figured I'd come check on my wards. Make sure you're treating them right." "They're fine," Elias said. His voice was flat, a wall of stone. Breckenridge's gaze slid past him to the girl. He appraised her, his eyes lingering in a way that made Elias's hands clench into fists at his sides. The girl's dress was still worn, but it was clean. Her hair was combed. She stood straighter. There was a life in her that had not been there before. "Looks like you've put them to work," Breckenridge said, a sneer touching his lips. "Good, but their holiday is over. I have orders. They're to be moved to the Sand Creek Reservation facility. All of them." The girl flinched at the name. Sand Creek. It was a place of ghosts and nightmares. "They're not going anywhere," Elias said. The words were low, but they carried the weight of an oath. Breckenridge laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "Don't be a fool, Thorne. They're not yours. They're property of the Territorial Authority. I have the paperwork. I've come to collect." He patted a leather satchel on his horse. "That paper is for a burden you were glad to be rid of," Elias said, taking a half-step forward, unconsciously placing himself more fully between Breckenridge and the girl. "They stay here." And who's going to stop me? You. Breckenridge's hand drifted down, resting casually on the butt of the pistol at his hip. This is official business. You interfere and you'll find yourself in a federal jail. This little homestead of yours will be forfeit. The world seemed to shrink to the space between the two men. The wind picked up, whipping dust around their boots. The sun was hot on the back of Elias's neck. He could feel the girl's fear behind him, a tangible thing. But there was something else there too, something hard and defiant. They are not leaving, Elias repeated, each word a stone laid in a foundation. Breckenridge's face hardened, the veneer of civility gone. I'm not asking, Thorne. I'm telling you. Round them up. Now. He started to dismount, swinging his leg over the saddle. And then the girl moved. She stepped out from behind Elias, placing herself in the open. She held a gutting knife in her hand, the one she had been using by the creek. It was a small blade, but she held it like it was a sword, its tip pointed unwaveringly at Breckenridge. Her voice, when she spoke, did not tremble. It was clear and sharp as flint. No! Breckenridge froze, one foot in the stirrup, one on the ground. He stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. He had seen a piece of property, a savage, a thing to be moved. He was not prepared for this. He was not prepared for a person. You stay away from them, she said, her English still broken, but her meaning absolute. She took a step forward, and the 9 other girls, drawn by the confrontation, appeared at the door and windows of the bunkhouse. Their small, dark faces a silent, accusing chorus. They were no longer a scattered, frightened flock. They were a clan. Breckenridge looked from the girl with the knife to the unyielding wall that was Elias Thorne. He saw the way the man stood, planted deep in the earth of his own land, ready to die for it, and for what was on it. He saw the fury in the girl's eyes, a fire he had thought long extinguished. He was a bully and a bureaucrat, a man who derived his power from paper and the fear of others. Faced with a power he didn't understand, the raw, unbending power of a home being defended, he faltered. He was a man of calculated risks, and the calculation he was doing in his head was not coming out in his favor. With a curse, he swung himself back into the saddle. He was a coward at his core, and his courage had found its limit. This isn't over, Thorne, he spat, his face red with humiliation. You'll regret this. He yanked his horse's head around and spurred it cruelly, galloping away in a cloud of his own angry dust, the threats trailing behind him like smoke. They stood there, the man and the girl, watching until he was just a speck on the horizon. The wind died down. The sudden, violent tension bled out of the air, leaving a profound quiet in its wake. Elias turned slowly. He looked at the girl. Her arm was still raised, the knife held steady. He gently reached out and put his hand over hers, his rough, calloused fingers covering her smaller ones. It's over, he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. For now. Her arm lowered, the knife falling to her side. The fierce strength seemed to drain out of her, and she swayed on her feet. He put a hand on her shoulder to steady her. It was the first time he had touched her for any reason other than necessity. It was not the touch of an owner or a master. It was the touch of an equal partner. I was scared, she whispered, looking at the ground. I know, he said. So was I. He looked at her, at the dirt on her cheek and the fire still smoldering in her eyes. You didn't run. She finally lifted her head and met his gaze. This is home, she said. The 2 words a simple, powerful declaration. That night, the house felt truly full for the first time. The unspoken threat had forged them into something new. They ate together, all 11 of them, around the big table, the smaller girls squeezed onto benches he'd dragged in from the bunkhouse. There was laughter, soft and tentative at first, then growing stronger. After the meal, when the little ones were asleep by the hearth, Elias and the girl sat in the 2 chairs, watching the flames. He will be back, she said. He might, Elias agreed. But this time the law might be on our side. You're not vagrants anymore. You're residence. He looked at her, at the young woman who had faced down an armed man for a piece of land she had no claim to, for a family she had built from ashes. "I don't know your name," he said quietly. It was not a demand. It was an admission, an opening. She was silent for a long time, tracing the grain of the wooden armrest with her finger. "My name was lost," she said finally, "on the trail, with my mother. It belongs to a different person." Elias nodded, understanding completely. He knew what it was to have a part of yourself buried in the earth. He thought of the light she had brought back into his house, the way she stood against the darkness. "Lena," he said, the name coming to him unbidden. "It means light." She looked up, her dark eyes searching his. She tested the sound of it on her tongue, a soft, questioning whisper. "Lena." He saw acceptance in her face. It was not the name she was born with, but it was a name for the person she had become. A name given not by an owner, but by a friend. It was a new beginning, a symbolic anchor in this new life. The next day, he went to the closed-off room. He carefully folded the dust sheets that had covered Sarah's things. He opened the windows and let the sun and air pour in. He moved the small bed out and brought in 2 of the bunks. It would be a room for the older girls now, for Lena and her second-in-command. It was no longer a shrine to the past. It was a part of a living home. Lena, without being asked, took the tattered dress she had arrived in, the one that smelled of fear and dust and desperation. She walked to the fire pit outside, and without ceremony, she dropped it into the flames. They stood together and watched it burn, the old life turning to ash. A fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. The final image was not one of triumph, but of simple, profound peace. A few weeks later, Elias sat on his porch steps, mending a leather strap. The setting sun painted the sky in gentle shades of rose and gold. The wind was soft. The 10 girls were scattered around the yard. Some of the little ones were chasing chickens, their laughter bright and clear. 2 of the older ones were sitting under the cottonwood tree, weaving baskets from river reeds. Lena came out of the house. She handed him a cup, not of chicory water, but of real coffee, saved for a special occasion. She sat on the step beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They watched the children play as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The house behind them was no longer a hollow, silent thing. It was breathing. It was full. It was alive. And in the quiet companionship of a man who had lost everything and a girl who had never had anything, something that looked an awful lot like a family had taken root in the hard, unforgiving soil and had begun, against all odds, to grow. A story like this, it ain't just about rescue. It's not about a strong man saving a damsel. That's too easy a tale, and the truth is rarely easy. This story, it's about naming. It's about looking at a person the world has labeled burden, or savage, or broken, and having the grace to see something else. To see not just what they are, but what they could be. Elias didn't give those girls charity. He gave them a chance to build their own worth. He gave them wood and nails, and they built a home. He gave one of them a name, and she gave him back his life. So here's your naming. Look at the empty spaces in your own life. The quiet rooms, the locked doors, the routines you walk through like a ghost. They aren't endings. They are fallow ground. They are the waiting earth. And you don't always know what seeds the wind will bring to your door. Most of the time, they look like trouble. They look like work. They look like something you'd rather turn away. But if you're brave enough to leave the door unlocked, if you're decent enough to offer a cup of water, you might just find that the things you thought were meant to be saved have come, in fact, to save you. You might find that the most beautiful light is the kind that finds its way, against all odds, into the darkest corners.